John W. Golden, Jr., known by his family and friends as Bud, was born in Hyde Park, New York, on East Market Street in his parents' home. This was the sixth house east of the St. James Chapel, known as one of the Tilly houses. And hopefully Bud will tell you a little bit about the Tilly houses in his talk. He attended the Hyde Park Union Free School here in the village, and then Statsburg High School. He was in the first graduating class of the new Franklin D. Roosevelt High School in Hyde Park in 1941. He went on to Cortland State for about 6 months and then joined the U.S. Army Air Corps and entered World War II. He served with the 8th Air Force in England during the war. When the war ended, he enrolled at Syracuse University and graduated in 1949. In 1950, he was lucky enough to marry Gloria Kidd, and they had 2 children.
Hey, that's
Jonathan and Elizabeth. He joined his father in the building business in 1958. John and Gloria have been very good to the people of Hyde Park, of which you all know, and have given many donations throughout the years. They recently had donated property to build the Hyde Park Police Department on Cardinal Road. And we are fortunate to have our Town of Hyde Park Historical Society Museum in the old firehouse building owned by them at no cost to us. Please help me welcome one of our Hyde Park natives, Fred Golden, who will be our speaker this evening. There you go.
Thank you, Patsy. I don't mind telling you, I feel under a great deal of pressure tonight with this audience here. We have some historians here and some folks from Statsburg and some people I've known an awful long time. There are a few old timers here, and I want to make sure I tell the truth. And there are a lot of new folks here, so thank you all for coming. I've always been interested, and I probably have asked some of you where you came from and why you came to Hyde Park. I've always been interested in geography and history, and I'm sure there are a few of you sitting out there that I've asked the question, where'd you come from and why'd you come to Hyde Park? Now I found out how you've come, and let me tell you how the Goldens came to Hyde Park. Let me tell you about my mother's side of the family. My grandfather was August Trout, and the Trout family lived near Steinau, Germany, and they ran a mill over there, and they came upon hard times and lost the mill, and when they lost the last cow, my great-grandfather decided to come to America, and he came over and landed in New York, and there was a man that had a mill on the Rojan Creek up in Gallatin that was looking for a miller, and he hired him on, and he went up to Gallatin and lived about a year and made enough money to send back for his wife and about 8 children to come over. And they lived in Gallatin a while, and they eventually moved into Rock City and ran a mill in Rock City, and he eventually came down to Hyde Park, and part of the Trout family ran a mill on the creek here up at the end of what's now Linden Lane, which once known as Trout's Lane when we grew up. And my grandfather came down from Gallatin also, and he went to work for the Vanderbilt, on the Vanderbilt farm, and took care of the horses up there. That takes care of my mother's side of the family. Now on my father's side of the family, his grandmother was a scriber, and the scribers came here from the German Palatine about the late 1700s and migrated down into Hyde Park. They were one of the older families here. And it was a large family in town, the scribers. I think they had 6 or 7 daughters and a couple of sons. And one of the scriber girls eventually became my grandmother. Now let me tell you about the Goldens. They came over, they were quite a little different family. They came over from County Mayo my great-grandfather came over in about 1832 and landed in New York. And he met an old Irish lady down there at the time, and she said, "Go north, young man." And he went north, and it was all sheep and goats up in Manhattan at that time, but he wandered out into Long Island, became a farmer out in Long Island. And when he died, he was 106, and he was the oldest man on Long Island at the time. They tell me he walked 4 miles into town every day before he died. He was a tough old Irishman. His name was Anthony Golden. But his son came to Poughkeepsie visiting at one time, and there was a racetrack down in Poughkeepsie near Vassar College, out off Hooker Avenue, the Hudson River Driving Park. And he came to visit a friend at the driving park, and he met a young lady from Hyde Park named Scriver, and he stayed on and got married. And he produced a family of 3 children. My grandfather August Trout had 4 children also. And my mother was a Trout, and she and my father eventually married. But I've got to tell you about the Golden children and about my grandfather Golden. He came to town, and he went to work on the Vanderbilt place as a painter. But he had a sideline of drinking quite often. He kept the saloons in business in Hyde Park, and he supposedly had married a woman on Long Island who was part Shinnecock Indian. And he thought he was an Indian, and once he got a few drinks under his belt, he ended up with the nickname Wahoo, and that's what they knew him as, Wahoo Golden in Hyde Park. He went around town waving his arms and yelling Wahoo. I can still remember him as a kid going around town. I was a little embarrassed to hear my grandfather going around yelling Wahoo. I don't think there's anybody left in town that remembers Wahoo Golden. The last fellow that did died a couple of months ago, and was Jerry Upright. And every time I saw Jerry, he'd say to me, "Boy, you remember Wahoo Golden?" And I was embarrassed. But he grew up in town here, and he had 3 children. He had a son, the first son, named Henry Golden, and he had my father, John Watson, and he had a daughter, Caroline. And they were all interesting people. Let me tell you a little bit about Henry Golden. Henry grew up in town and married a local gal here in town and became FDR's chauffeur. And he went to Washington when Roosevelt became Assistant Secretary of Navy down in Washington. And as it goes, FDR went out on a shakedown cruise on one of the Navy ships for about a week. And while he was gone, even though my uncle had 2 children in Washington with him and a wife, he decided to take the secretary out one evening on the town, and FDR had just bought a new car. Well, he wrecked the car. And FDR came back from the cruise, and the story goes that he sat down with Eleanor and said, "What are we going to do with Henry? We've lost confidence in him, and I think we're going to have to send him back to Hyde Park." Incidentally, my father went down there. He was younger, and my brother took him down there, and he lived there a while. Well, he had to come back to Hyde Park too. And I think Roosevelt lined up jobs on the New York Central Railroad when they came back here. And my uncle Henry spent 40 years on the railroad. My father, they both started the same day, and my father spent 1 day firing, and he thought, that's it for him. So, but he decided, let me tell you a little bit about my Aunt Caroline also. She married a man in Hyde Park named Van Wagner, Elmer Van Wagner, and Elmer eventually became supervisor. But Caroline had 4 children. I'm sorry, I don't think Elmer's here tonight. Her son Elmer Jr. lives in town, but he's not doing too well now. I was hoping he could come out tonight because I could tell a few stories about him. But Caroline grew up and raised 4 children here. But my Uncle Henry came back to town. Would you believe he had 13 children? He had 12 girls and 1 boy. And the boy was Bucky Golden, who was a town supervisor years ago. Well, there's only 1 left right now, lives down in Georgia, 1 out of those 13. But his wife died from having too many children. She wasn't healthy. She wasn't wealthy either, but she wasn't healthy either. And he married again and had 2 more children. But so there were a lot of Goldens around Hyde Park in those days. She finally passed away after the 13th child. And what's a father do with 13 children? You know, we didn't have any social services in those days or any other way of taking care of kids, so they were scattered amongst the village. We had a lot of aunts and uncles in the village, and he had a lot of friends. and certain people took, one would take one in, a couple of them took two in, and my Aunt Caroline had four already, but she took four of her brother's children and raised 8 children. She was a great lady. And, the town was loaded with relatives. I think I was related to about 1/3 of the town. The town had probably a dozen big families in those days, and I was probably related to 1/3 of the town, and some other families that, well, they intermarried. George Briggs always told me about 5 Briggses marrying 5 DeGroffs in those days in the same family. I don't know whether they're all boys or all girls that married each other, but that happened. There was a lot of intermarriage in those days. It was a small village of about 750 people. But let me tell you a little bit about growing up in Hyde Park here. I've got a few notes here, and it was like a feudal system here. Most everybody worked on the estates. They all got their living from the estates. We had a few tradesmen around town. We had a couple grocery stores. We had a butcher shop. We had a funeral home, and a couple saloons, and I can remember a couple of attorneys in town. There were a number of people too that commuted to Poughkeepsie and worked at the old Delaval Separator Company, or at the Schatz Federal, or a few other businesses in Poughkeepsie. But basically, we depended on the estates for our living in those days. A little story about my grandfather Trout. Took care of the horses up on the Vanderbilt place, and one day it was a zero weather, and they'd been out a couple days into the woods cutting firewood, the farm hands, and one day it got down to zero, and the superintendent came in and said to my grandfather, "Don't send the team out in the woods today, it's too cold, send the men out to cut the woods." I think that may give you an idea how they felt about their animals. But Vanderbilt had teams of workhorses, but he had a great big black stallion, a Belgian stallion named King. Huge animal, mean animal. He kicked my grandfather one time and broke his leg, and he limped forever after. But he used to have to exercise that big black stallion through the village here. And I was a little kid, and he'd go down through the woods along the creek and come over down East Market Street. And I was a little tyke like that, and heist me up in that, gee, that looked like a huge animal to me in those days, and a big 2-wheel wagon. And would you believe we'd exercise that big stallion through the village here, up and down the side streets in those days? There weren't many automobiles running up and down the road. Let's see. We had, like many of you growing up, you probably had your old swimming holes in town. We had a swimming hole up along the creek. The Trout's Mill dammed up the creek, and everybody in the village went to Trout's Pond along the creek to learn how to swim and to swim. And there was a well-beaten path through the Dutch Reformed churchyard, through the graveyard, over the stone wall, and down through the woods to the creek. And it was well used in my youth. And well, typically we had our sledding, like everybody else, I suppose. We grew up in small towns. We had our sledding area down Wales's Hill to the river, and down along the main entrance to Vanderbilt's down to White Bridge, and they let us ski sometimes down the slope over by the Vanderbilt Mansion. Speaking of the Vanderbilt Mansion, I have an advertisement that when the Vanderbilt property came on the market in 1939. Would anybody venture a guess as to what that 700-acre property, all the way from the river, the mansion, the farm, beautiful barns, and a dozen houses or so on the farm, way over east, almost to 9G. What was that on the market for in 1939? $350,000. You could have bought that whole property. My uncle ended up buying the farm part of it for $20,000 in those days, all those barns and houses, and so, but there weren't many dollars around those. Would you believe the taxes were $16,000 on that whole property those days? Some of us are paying darn near $16,000 today on a little home in Hyde Park. Enough about the value of Vanderbilt property. Oh, I must tell you, gee, I mentioned that we had a couple of blacksmiths in town in those days too, and I spent many a summer afternoon. I don't know whether any of you have ever been around a blacksmith shop, but Margie's husband Jim used to go down to the Bert Burdick's blacksmith shop and sit there many a day, and I can still smell those hoofs burning. There's a certain smell that comes from a blacksmith shop, and we had two of them in town. Bert Burdick over on East Market Street did the Vanderbilt horses and the horses from the east, and Bert Wig on Alverson Street did the Roosevelt horses and the Morgans and the Rogers horses down on the south end of town. The town was pretty well split up. The north end of the town here, the main old center section down, the people worked on the Vanderbilt place, and down on the south end of town, they worked on the Rogers or the Morgans or the Roosevelt estate. So there's quite a dividing line there in those days. And it was interesting. If you were around about 7:30 in the morning, you would see probably a dozen bicyclers going north to the Vanderbilt estate, just like a feudal system from Europe. Didn't have automobiles, and my grandfather hopped on his bicycle every morning. I can remember him putting that metal clip on his trousers to keep it out of the spokes, out of the chain, and head pedaling north. And about 5 o'clock, if you looked down the road or up the road there, those bicyclists would be coming back down the road, coming home at night. Very interesting. It's now I got to tell you a little bit about schooling in Hyde Park. Our old brick school was opposite Sweet's Funeral Home, where there's a defunct gas station now. Would you believe that they toured, when the new village school was opened in 1940, that Roosevelt had a big hand in? They tore down that red brick school, historical red brick school, talk about vision, and put a gas station in there. Now we're left with an empty gas station. And hopefully that 1940 school will remain active for a while. I hope. Roosevelt had a great influence in building that school, and actually his father was on the school board at the little old red schoolhouse that I went to. Everybody in Hyde Park went to this village school. We walked to school, we walked home for lunch, we walked back, and the kids from East Park were trucked or bused into the school, and it was a wonderful school. They finally expanded it to a 2-year high school, and that lasted a little while, and would you believe it, little old Statsburg had more vision than Hyde Park. When Roosevelt had the PWA, WPA, they decided to build a school in the early 1930s. And we eventually, when we graduated from the 8th grade here, we all went to Statsburg High School. Before that, they had 2 years here, and they'd have 2 years down to Poughkeepsie, take the train or the bus to Poughkeepsie. But we were bused to Statsburg, and they had a lot more vision than we did at those times. And it was a wonderful school experience. Eventually, the new FDR High School was built in 1940, and I happened to be in the first graduating class. We had to come down there as seniors, and we were in the first graduating class at FDR High School. But it's a doggone shame that that school was ever torn down here. We've ended up with a decrepit old empty service station. I've got a couple of, probably a lot of you fellows when you grew up, I had a father who was a workaholic. He didn't believe in vacation. He believed in working all the time. And that meant I worked with him in a lot of cases. And for example, we made our own concrete blocks. There's some houses existing in Hyde Park yet that have concrete blocks made by Jim Spratt and John Golden, still standing. But we'd be down and sitting at dinner most of the evenings, and I'd have other ideas. And he'd say, "We're making blocks tonight." So we made concrete blocks, and I conned Jimmy Spratt, my good pal across the road. I conned Jimmy Spratt into I paid him 2 cents a block to help me make concrete blocks. But I had a couple of interesting incidents working with my father. One day we had an old Westinghouse electric stove up on 4 high legs, about 3 feet high. I don't know if any of you remember those stoves, with the oven up on the side. And my father sold it for, money was tight in those days, the 30s. I was about 14, we had an old truck. My father sold the electric range for $10 to Mr. Ingolia, who had a little old store out in East Park where Stewart's is now. So my father said, "Hey, Brud, get the stove, put the stove on the truck and deliver it to Mr. Ingolia and get the $10. So I put the stove on the truck, and like a dummy, I didn't tie it down. And for some reason or other, I didn't take the good road to East Park. I thought, I'm going over the Mill Road. I don't know why, I was a wise guy. So I head over the Mill Road in that sharp curve out there. You know the sharp curve. Geez, I went around that curve and I looked through the rearview mirror. Over went the stove. And it was cast iron and it broke into 1,000 pieces. What do you do now? I thought, what do I do now? Mr. Ngoli is over there with the $10, and my father's home waiting for the $10. And I thought, geez, what am I going to do? So I thought quite quickly, and I thought, I'm heading over to see Mr. Ngolia. And I go over there, and he said, where's the stove? I said, geez, Mr. Ngolia. My father was so embarrassed. That was in such miserable shape. He was too embarrassed to sell you the stove for $10. So he accepted that story. So I thought, what the devil am I going to do when I get home? My father was waiting, really wanted the $10. Geez, I got home, and he said, what happened? Where's the $10? And I said, oh, geez, I lost the stove on the way over. And that was a bad day in my life. Gee, let me tell you one other bad day too. I used to hang around with my father when he was building houses, and he built a house down on Fuller Lane for Helen Fink's cousin or relative. And he made a deal with him to build the house, but there was a maple tree about 6 inches in diameter out in the front yard. And Mr. Freer, his name was, said, I want that tree saved. No matter what you do, save that tree. So he got the house pretty well built, and he had an old Fortune tractor and grading around there, and he nicked the bark with that tractor, just how you can scuff the bark about 3 feet up, and went about his business. I didn't have, he took me on the job that day. I was about 4, and I didn't have anything to do, so I went out and I started stripping that bark off the tree. Boy, when he caught me, it's the only time he ever gave me a little, only once in a lifetime he ever patted my fanny and said, you're going home, no more on the job. So, he was upset over that. Mr. Freer wanted the tree, so he took a bunch of tar down and tarred the tree and wrapped it and hoped to save this tree. And he got the house, darn if he didn't get the house done. And Mr. Freer said, take the tree down, I don't want it. That was an interesting day. Oh, now, see, I've told you about schools. Oh, one other story about schools. Bob, you'll enjoy this. We were in school in the old village grade school. Babe Ruth had just quit, just retired. And Doug Crapser was Vanderbilt's chauffeur, Doug Sr., Vanderbilt's chauffeur. His boy was in my class and my closest pal in those days. And young Doug came to school one day and said, gee, would you like to go to Yankee Stadium? My father wants to take us to Yankee Stadium. We'd never been to New York, let alone being at Yankee Stadium. So, he took his son and myself and Harold Kipp, 3 of us, and lo and behold, he took us down in Vanderbilt's big limousine. He drove us down as his chauffeur to Yankee Stadium. Gee, I can remember all the players yet. He drove up in front of Yankee Stadium, pulled up right by the ticket window. He went to the window, he said, I got 3 young boys from Hyde Park, from the country, never been to New York or a ball game. He said, give us some good seats, will you? And the old Washington Senators played that day. But that was a real thrill to have that happen while we were in school. Oh, let's see, I've got to talk about politics in Hyde Park. Now, you can't let this go without talking a little bit about politics. And you think politics was nasty recently. It was really nasty in those days. You were either a rabid Republican or a rabid Democrat. My family happened to be, most of my family, the Trouts were Republicans, but the Goldens were Democrats. And I grew up during the Roosevelt era when, Roosevelt was always president. And my uncle ran for supervisor here, and there hadn't been a Democrat elected in oodles of years, so he got elected. But the party faithful used to work hard to get the voters in, And I can remember that they sold votes for $1 in those days. Each party handed out $1 for a vote. I can remember my father going out through the country. He had to pick up certain people out there, and you gave him $1 to come in and vote. And he even said he went in the booth a few times and showed them how to vote. But one interesting story, my aunt worked hard for her husband too, and she went up on the crossroad one day and picked up this elderly couple on a little farm up there to bring them down to vote. I don't know when she gave them whether she gave them the $2 when she got to the farm or not, but she headed down the road towards the Vanderbilt place, and she overheard the couple say in the back, "We only vote along the Chickie line," which was a Republican line in those days. And boy, once she heard that, she spun right around the middle of the road, took them back and left them off at the farm. Never even gave them a chance to vote. I don't know whether she lost the $2 or not. But a little more about my father makes me think of he was a real entrepreneur. He thought he didn't want to become part of this feudal system when he came back to Hyde Park here. So he ended up with three other men. They joined forces and they built the Hyde Park Motor Company on the corner where it is now, and became a Model T dealer. And he eventually sold that, and he bought a bus line that ran from Red Hook to Poughkeepsie. The old name of the bus line, I don't know if anybody ever remembers, the Twilight bus line ran. And I still have a paper home that shows all the stops between Red Hook and Poughkeepsie for the Twilight bus line. And then he eventually went in the building business and built a lot of houses around Hyde Park. Gee, I've got some old records yet of the cost of building houses in the late 20s. Gee, I don't think Bernie Kessler's here tonight. Bernie Kessler's father had a team of horses and a hand scoop. What do you think Bernie Kessler's father charged? I've got the records. Bernie Kessler's father charged $8 to dig a cellar in those days. Can you believe that? I grew up, my father bought 3 houses for $900 a piece on East Market Street, and I grew up in one of them in those days. I can tell you an awful lot about real estate property. If I have a chance again sometime, I'll tell you about real estate properties, real estate costs. But a little bit more about election. We were having dinner one night when I was about 4 years old, and Roosevelt was running for governor at the time, I believe, and we just finished dinner. My father said, "Bud, grab your coat, we're going in a torchlight parade. We're going to pick up Uncle Hen, and we're going in this big torchlight parade." So he had a couple of sticks with rags wrapped down the end of them, soaked in oil, and we go down the street and pick up my great Uncle Hen, and he was a great Roosevelt man, and I sat in the back seat, and they two sat in the front, and they held torches out the window, and we joined a long line of cars in a torchlight parade, and this is 1928, I remember. I don't know where we went, but we probably went to Statsburg along the way. I think we probably ended up at the Roosevelt estate, but boy, that sticks in my memory, seeing those cars with all those torches. We also was interesting, the local elections here, plus the presidential elections. We used to go to the town hall in the evening when they'd finish counting the votes, and they always had to count the absentee votes. And I remember one night Cecil Marshall ran for road commissioner that night, and they got down to the last absentee ballot, and Cecil Marshall's name was on it, and he won by 1 vote, so 1 vote does count. He was forever after known as 1 vote Marshall. And those nights after town election, after all the votes were counted, we used to march down to the Roosevelt estate, some people carrying torches, and FDR would come out on the porch. I think I have a picture here. Well, my wife was going through the archives down there one time, and gee, she saw the fellow she's married to in the crowd out in front of the Roosevelt porch there. That was the night that Cecil Marshall won by 1 vote. And Elmer Ben Wagner had won. My Uncle Elmer had won also. Another big event in town in those days, remember the March of Dimes? They had one big dance in town, in the old town hall every year, and it was the March of Dimes dance. And all the families in town went to this dance. And they hook up an old radio there, and I can remember dancing stopped at a certain time. I don't know what the hour was, but FDR came on and gave his March of Dimes speech, and those things still are great memories for me. I must mention the Roosevelt Home Club also. A group of people got together here who were Roosevelt supporters and formed a home club to support Roosevelt in his principles and beliefs. And Patsy's mother, I think, was the last president of the Roosevelt Home Club. My mother was the last secretary. I still have some tags and information about the old Roosevelt Home Club. And they went to Washington, and I still have actually the program from the his first inauguration in 1933 with John Nance Garner as vice president. And it lists the Hyde Park Home Club marching in the parade. I did hear another story about it too. When the group from Hyde Park went down there, we had relatives over in Virginia on a farm, and they missed part of the parade. They got into the booze over in Virginia celebrating his election, and they missed part of the proceeds. Now, a couple of big events happened in my lifetime. I thought one that happened really was the Boy Scouts. I was in a Boy Scout troop here, and the pastor of this church, Reverend Frank Wells, a wonderful gentleman. He loves scouting like no one else loves scouting. And the first Boy Scout Jamboree came along in 1937. They wanted to scout from Hyde. They formed a Dutchess County troop, and they wanted to scout from Hyde Park to join the troop. And he picked me out to go to the first National Jamboree in 1937, and it was a big deal. We formed a boy from every town, almost every town in the county, and we had a marching band. We marched down Main Street, took the ferry across to the railroad station over on the west shore, and took a troop train to Washington. I have a picture here. We had a replica of Roosevelt's Springwood home that I think Western Printing built, and it was an exact replica home. It almost looks like his home, and we took that with us to Washington and set it up over where the Pentagon is now, is our campground. And it's funny, Roosevelt was coming to visit us one day, the Dutchess County troop. And you know what thought went through my mind? I thought, you know what he's going to do? He's going to say, where's that kid from Hyde Park? I want to see that. So, geez, I got excited like I am tonight. I hid in the back row, and he never did ask for the kid from Hyde Park. But he pinned an Eagle Scout Award on one of our scouts but he had all the leading scouting figures in the country with him in his touring car that day. But that was one of the really big things happened in my young life here. But the other big thing was when the King and Queen came to Hyde Park. Oh, what a day that was. Visited the Roosevelts and visited our church, and they had the hot dog roast, and Jimmy Spratt, my pal, and I, it was gridlock in Hyde Park. Cars coming in from the east, the north, and south, and they couldn't move. Thousands and thousands of people here, and Jimmy and I started parking cars. I think we might have charged $1 a car that day. We made a few bucks, I know, both of them. But he had a bigger parking lot than I did. That was a great time in town. Let me tell you, if I got time, Betsy, let me tell you about a little issue at the church at those days. You know, we had a limited number of seats available. We had all the dignitaries coming, and there were a limited number of seats available. I think about 75 for parishioners. Well, how do you decide which 75 get to come into the church with the King and Queen? That was a real issue. There were hard feelings over that. I know my mother stood outside the church. But that was a big day, and you've all heard about the hot dog roast and Harry Johansson going down to the Mohegan Market to buy the hot dogs for the King and Queen. The other big time in Hyde Park was Pearl Harbor Day. Gee, that, you know, I was about 17 at the time, and I was sitting home Sunday afternoon, listening to the radio, listening to a pro football game, and the word came about 3 o'clock that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and what do? We head down to the Zeph soda fountain and saloon and the gathering place in Hyde Park, and there were 8 or 10 boys near my age in Hyde Park, and we had one boy who was in the service, was home on leave, and he he got us so stirred up that day. If there'd been a recruiter there, he'd have had 8 or 10 fellows sign up immediately. But that changed all our lives here, and I'm sure it changed a lot of your family's lives too. And we ended up, our high school class, I think everyone except one boy who stayed back on the farm to run the farm. Everybody else went in the service in those days. And some girls joined up too in the nurses' corps and the WACs and the waves. But then, I was going to stop here at Pearl Harbor Day, but the war ended, and it was really an end of an era in Hyde Park. The estate era ended. The fuel system was no more. The government had taken over the Roosevelt place, and eventually the Morgan place, and the government had taken over the Vanderbilt place, and Statsburg, the mills had been taken over by the state. And amazingly, the Rogers family that owned the Crumwold estate, probably one of the nicest, if not the nicest estate along the river here. It had 900 acres from the river over to Route 9G. And I guess the taxes became too heavy for the Rogers family, as well off as they were. Actually, a little bit about the Rogers family. One of the sons of Colonel Rogers, who lived on the Crumwold estate here, owned a villa in France also. And that's where the Duke Wally and the Duke Edward were married at his villa, the man that lived here on the Crumwold estate. Very interesting. But they decided they didn't want the estate anymore. And would you believe what that estate was purchased for? My family was involved in the purchase. Would you believe what that 900-acre estate, all the way from the river to 9G, probably a dozen houses, beautiful barns, 75-room mansion. Would you want to take a guess at what that was purchased for in 1946? $225,000. Can you believe that? It took about $15,000 down in those days to gamble on buying that. And a man named Trotsky that ran a school for boys down in New Haven decided to come here, and he paid $75,000 for that Rogers mansion, and that really put it over the top, that $75,000. So it's, boy, were times different. But I'll end now with another miracle came along in my life, and that's when St. James called a man by the name of Kidd. And my wife would be embarrassed if I tell you this story, but he brought a young lady with him named Kidd who had lived working in New York. And I was home from school, and we went to church. I've got to tell you, probably half of you heard this story, but I got to tell you the story about going to church Christmas Eve. And we sat there, we were the first in church, and eventually a lady came in with a young lady and sat in the front pew, and I said to my mother, "Who's that?" She said, "Gee, that's the new rector with his wife, new rector's wife and daughter." And I thought, "Oh, geez, she's a pretty sharp chick in my estimation." But I didn't meet her. She left for California the next day and to go for good. But lo and behold, it was a miracle. She came back, and I met her. Well, I got up my nerve that summer. But in the meantime, as a new rector, her father was calling on all the parishioners, and he called on my mother, and he said, "Gee, what kind of a family do you have?" And she said, "Oh, I have 3 daughters and a son," but she said, "My son doesn't like girls. All he thinks about is playing ball." Little did he know that I would have my eye on his daughter. But she came back that summer, and I got up my nerve, and I called her up one night, and her mother had answered the phone. "Are you embarrassed?" Well, I called her up, and her mother answered the phone, and I said, "Gee, could I speak to Gloria Kidd, please?" And she said, "Gee, I'm sorry, she's in the tub." I said, "Well, you tell her I'll call again." And I knew myself, I would never take a second shot. I would never call again. Just as I was about to hang up the phone, she said, "Hold on, I'll get her out of the tub." And that was it. That was the beginning. And that's the miracle that took place on Park Place. So, oh, Kate, I've got Just, if I got time for two other. See, when we were Boy Scouts at the Jamboree, there was a Dutchess County song. And I think someone by the name of Mylett in the Mylett family might have written this song. And I bet, Margie, I bet you've heard, I bet no one else has heard this. And I'll sing it for you, it's a very short one verse. Oh, this was our theme song at the Jamboree. Oh, we're from Dutchess County and we'd like to have you know that Dutchess County is the place where luscious apples grow. They call us apple knockers and we don't deny the fact, because apple knockers are the guys that make the apple jack. Now just one other little verse here, and I don't know whether any of you have heard this. You politicians have heard this, you Democrats or not. But this was there's some nasty writings about Roosevelt back in those days, about Eleanor and Franklin, and I happened to come across one I had home here. I don't know if anybody's heard this or not, but I'll read it to you here. I pledge allegiance to the Democratic Party and to the Roosevelt family to which it belongs. One family indispensable with colonels, lieutenants, and divorces for all. 4,000 years ago, Moses said to his people, pick up your shovels, mount your asses, load your camels, and ride with me to the promised land. 4,000 years later, Roosevelt said to his people, throw down your shovels, sit on your asses, light a camel, this is the promised land.
Well, we have a little something for you, Brad. It's not an awful lot, but we know that you were on a cruise recently when we had our violets presentation. So we do have...
Can I tell them what happened? We got sick probably the whole darn time.
Don't tell them that. They won't want to go on a cruise. Anyway, we have the Sweet Violets DVD for you.
Oh, very nice, Betsy.
And we also have a book for you. Actually, Helen Murray, wherever she is, had told me about it. It's called Chi-Chi's Trunk.
Yes.
And it's the true story of Roots and Branches by John Ward Vandewater. And it's a very historical book of this area. And it talks about the Budds and the Vandewaters and the Marshalls and a whole lot of people in this area. So we hope you enjoy that.
Gee, I will. I know the Vandewaters. They live down the river back at Dave Friends up on the hill there. It's an interesting family. It'll be an interesting book. Thanks, Patsy. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.